Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer McHugh. I'm the manager of adult learning at the Michener. I want to welcome you to our program tonight. Uh, our guest, Bill Perthes, will be speaking on Peter Paone and his exhibit, Not So Still Life. If you have not been to see it, I encourage you to go check it out. It is a fun one to explore. We will be If you have questions during Bill's presentation, you can enter them into the Q&A and we will have time at the end of the program to answer those. So I will pass it off to Laura Igo, the Jerry and Marguerite Lenfest Chief Curator.
Thank you, Jen. It is my great pleasure this evening to introduce Bill Perthes. Bill is the Bernard C. Watson Director of Adult Education at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. Bill has a background in philosophy and art history, and he is the author of The Barnes Method, which is included in the recently published The Barnes Then and Now. Much of Bill's work focuses on how experiences with works of art, both short and long term, can impact and inform fields as varied as business, medicine, law enforcement, and restorative justice. Bill is the curator of Faces of Resilience, a traveling exhibition of original works of art created by currently and formerly incarcerated artists at the State Correctional Institute Phoenix in Collegeville, Pennsylvania. In addition, his scholarship has focused on American modernism with a special concentration on the abstract expressionist painter Robert Motherwell. He is the former director of education for the Violette de Mazia Foundation. So this evening, Bill will talk about recent still life paintings by Peter Paone, which is in this body of work, as Jen mentioned, is now on view at the Michener in Peter Paone Not So Still Life, which you can see now until March 15th. So Bill will be discussing the influence of Dutch Vanitas paintings on this body of work, and also we'll talk about Peter's relationship with the Barnes Foundation. And I'm kind of joined appropriately. I know he's a little blurred out by my cat this evening, Charlie, which if you've seen Peter's body of work or work in the Still Life show, you'll understand that it's kind of thematically relevant. So I will turn it over to Bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Jen. Thank you for inviting me to talk about this really fascinating exhibition. And if you haven't seen the exhibition yet, I hope that this talk encourages you to go see it because the works are something to see on a screen, on a monitor, but they're really worth seeing in person. Um, so let's get started. Here we go. So, visiting this exhibition, Peter Paone, Not So Still Life, viewers encounter images filled with curious combinations of objects. For instance, here in Birthday, a candlestick table supports a pedestal dish displaying a richly decorated cake. Smoke trails from a single recently extinguished candle, yet unappetizingly, on and around these crawl snails. In assembled magic, against ornately patterned wallpaper, a glowing candle and seemingly expired bird adorn a dark mound of uncertain material. Soap bubbles float about and which, along with the candle, give the image a celebratory quality, despite the mound's questionable materials. In other images, skulls populate or seemingly oversee the collected objects, such as in A Gathering and Charting a Journey. In many of the works, elements are put in uncomfortable arrangements. In this picture of formative nature, an owl, perhaps taxidermied, is entrapped under a bell jar, prominently displayed next to another confection, again with an extinguished candle. Together with the dangling streamer at left, the extinguished candle suggests the party is over. These works are humorous, surprising, perplexing, and sometimes disturbing. Sometimes adversarial elements coexist, a cat with birds, or insects with sweets. So, what are we to make of these unusual, often unsettling images? Well, they're not without precedent. Many of the elements found in these strange arrangements have roots in the tradition of Vanitas or memento mori. These were paintings very popular in the 17th century Dutch tradition, but they have a precedent that reaches much further back into history than that. Seen in this light, Paone is drawing from and building on these traditions, which, as we'll see, stretch back hundreds and indeed thousands of years. These images allow for multiple readings. We can puzzle over the unexpected choice and arrangement of objects, some easily identifiable, others less so. We can extrapolate implied scenarios from the objects. We can build imaginary stories around their origins and meanings. Or we can mine the history of the Vanitas and memento mori tradition for guidance to possible other readings. And tonight I'd like to take that latter path. Because, like Peter's work, pictures in our collection at the Barnes also resonate with the Vanitas and memento mori tradition. This connection is not incidental, but the Barnes played a formative role in Peter Paone's development as a painter. So, my aim this evening is threefold. Framing my talk is Peter's connection with the Barnes, which I'll briefly describe in a moment. Then I'll turn to the tradition of Vanitas and memento mori, giving some background and history by way of close consideration of a few works. As we do so, we'll return to the works from Not So Still Life exhibition, tying these threads together. There should be time, as Jen said, at the end for some Q&A. So let's begin by stepping away from the pictures for a moment. Among the formative influences on Peter Paone, including his growing up in South Philadelphia, working in a frame shop and in the Italian market as a young boy, was an improbable introduction to the Barnes Foundation, its collection and role not as a museum, but as a school. In 1951, as Peter tells the story, at the age of 15, hearing about the collection of art at the Barnes, Peter ventured from South Philadelphia to Marion. This was only a year after our founder, Dr. Albert Barnes, had been killed in an automobile accident. And entrance to the collection, unbeknownst to Peter, was reserved either for Barnes students or by invitation. So when Peter arrived, the gates were closed and chained. Undaunted, he climbed the gates and knocked on the large, imposing oak front doors. His knock was answered by none other than Violette de Mazia. Miss de Mazia had initially been hired as a French tutor for the Barnes staff in 1925, the very year that the foundation opened. She quickly became a protege of Dr. Barnes, and together they authored 4 books together, including monographs on Henri Matisse, Paul Cézanne, and Pierre-Auguste Renoir. Following Barnes's death, Miss de Mazia became director of the art education program at the foundation. Education was, and very much is still today, the mission of the Barnes. We were chartered by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1922 as an educational institution. So, despite her best efforts, the young Paone would not be turned away. But through his childish tenacity, he worked his way into the building, where he first encountered works by Picasso and Matisse, So in this archival image, you'll see Picasso's composition in the lower right-hand corner, Matisse's seated Riffian in the left, and then surmounting both of them, the large Barnes dance mural by Matisse. Staying in the main gallery, we see works by Cézanne and Renoir, and the wall to our left, the north wall, is given over entirely to works by Renoir and Cézanne. Facing west, we see at the bottom Cézanne's large card players, and above that, Georges Seurat's models. So this was Peter's first introduction to these artists and to the collection. So when Peter returned later that year to attend a seminar, he did so in the galleries, sitting and learning directly from these works of art. So in the 1950s, this was Peter's first connection with the Barnes, one that began then but has continued to this day. We'll return to the Barnes in a bit, but now I'd like us to consider the idea of memento mori and vanitas. So, what do these terms mean? Memento mori is from the Latin, translating as remember you must die. So in many ways, memento mori of these two is the most direct, right? It's making a direct call to the viewer, a reminder to the viewer that of the inevitability of death. Vanitas, on the other hand, and while these terms are often used interchangeably, there are nuances between them. Vanitas is more directed at human vanities, to the pursuit of worldly goods or even worldly knowledge. So memento mori oftentimes signals, sometimes very directly, the very finality of life, where vanitas calls our attention to remember that inevitability and that many of the earthly pursuits that we try to attain ultimately are going to be immaterial to that ultimate effect cause for all of us. So these subjects very much came into fashion in the 17th century, most prominently in Dutch paintings of that period, driven largely by the spread of the theology of John Calvin or Calvinism, one of the most strict sects of the Protestant Reformation. Calvin himself preached the doctrine of predestination and of God's absolute sovereignty in the salvation of the human soul from death and eternal damnation. So it was a very strict way of considering the role of how one is to live here on earth, with an eye not towards what we might achieve here, but towards the afterlife. Then in the Netherlands, keeping in mind, prior to this, had spent nearly a century in constant conflict with the Catholic Spanish crown, trying to achieve independence. After about 100 years of fighting, that was eventually achieved, and the 7 most northern provinces gathered together in a loosely formed republic that was predominantly Protestant by nature. And that was distinguished from the southern Flanders, which by and large remained Roman Catholic. In doing so, for the Dutch Republic, these northern seven provinces, in doing so, by adapting and adopting Protestantism, they generally rejected the kind of religious painting that had been popular prior to this, and instead adopted more secular subjects, including the elevation of landscape and still life painting. So it's the Dutch 17th century tradition that really give to us these so common traditions of subjects of landscape and still life. Amongst these, Vanitas and memento mori developed as a form of still life with a strong moral and spiritual overtone. Often we see these as being very directly so, as we see in this picture that we're looking at here from the Dutch artist Van Dalen. But these themes of memento mori long predated the Dutch tradition, stretching back long before the Christian era, uh, in images such as I show you here, a mosaic from Pompeii, unearthed in the excavation of that buried city, which dates from roughly around 50 BC. And many of the symbolic elements in this picture are ones that carry over and continue through the centuries in this tradition of Vanitas and memento mori. For instance, the prominently displayed skull, whether animal or human, as we saw in the previous image, the skull becomes potentially the most prominent image in the memento mori tradition, right? That reminder of the inevitability of death. Few things as direct as the skull. In this mosaic, above the skull hangs a scale, and from the scale, uh, down the center is a plumb bob. So, and each of these elements have symbolic or suggest symbolic interpretations. The plumb bob, for instance, suggests propriety, uprightness, and virtue, while the scale, and we see on either side things suspended from that scale, on our left is a fine purple cloak and white sash, fine garments, likely from a wealthy citizen, where on our right we see the rough clothes, sack, and walking stick of a beggar. So the balance of wealth uh, to its opposite. Beneath the skull, we see butterfly wings, sometimes interpreted as symbolic of the delicacy of the human soul. And beneath that, at the very bottom, a wheel symbolizing fortune or fate. So if we return to the Dutch version of the Vanitas, it also is embedded by many symbolic aspects and elements. In the upper right-hand corner, we see an extinguished candle. This is intended to suggest the potential quick and permanent extinguished life, so that life can very quickly come to an end. We see that here. Beneath that, and beneath the skull, we see books and manuscripts. So this, in many ways, is inclined towards the idea of the vanitas, that amongst earthly pursuits is also the pursuit of knowledge. And it's a kind of, again, a kind of warning that the kind of knowledge we pursue here on earth for all of its potential benefit pales to the kind of spiritual pursuit that, again, sort of Calvinist beliefs would have instructed their congregants to follow. So again, the weighing of earthly knowledge to spiritual knowledge. And then the skull. And in this image, we have not only a skull, but also a femur. I mentioned earlier the division of the Netherlands between a Protestant North Dutch Republic and a Catholic South Flanders, with the elimination, by and large, of religious subjects in paintings and the adoption of these still lifes. Many of the symbolic elements from religious paintings carried over into these still life paintings. And I'm going to show you an example of that here. So here we turn to our collection at the Barnes. We're in Gallery 3, looking at the west wall, and I'm going to focus our attention on the crucifixion that's in the center of this ensemble. It's by an likely an Austrian painter from the early part of the 15th century. And it has it's populated by all of the characters that would have been familiar to the faithful in when they would look at a crucifixion. So we have obviously Christ on the cross. We have the soldiers both taunting Christ, piercing his side. Down towards the lower left-hand side, we have the Virgin Mary fainting, supported by Mary Magdalene. In the lower right-hand corner, we have other guards gambling for Christ's cloak. So these are all sort of standard elements in a typical crucifixion. But I want to call our attention to this area in the crevice between and below, between the groupings and below the crucifixion. And as we look closely, and keep in mind this is a small panel, as we look closely, we find two skulls and a bone, again, a femur. And this very much taps into the story, the biblical story of the crucifixion. So the crucifixion, as Christianity holds, took place on the Mount of Golgotha. And it's believed that that was the burial place of Adam and Eve. And indeed, for the faithful, they would have recognized the crucifixion as a moment that was preordained to erase the original sin of Adam and Eve, of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So memento mori, in many ways, not only connects to a very sort of earthly approach, but also continues to resonate with biblical and theological intentions. So the idea of the skull is, as I said earlier, one of the most prominent elements within this tradition. And it takes lots of different forms. So here, another work from our collection found in Gallery 14 on the south wall, a painting by the Spanish artist El Greco, a painting of St. Francis and Brother Leo. And the very format of the painting, and the title supports this, is a meditation on death. So here the idea of memento mori takes a very literal form in the meditative state of St. Francis. But other works in our collection, while still resonating with those traditions, have moved in a more sort of secular way. And here, I think, in many ways, we're getting closer to something that's more akin to what we see in Peter Paone's work. One of two works that we'll look at by Paul Cézanne in our collection include skulls as part of their composition. Skulls populate a few early works by Cézanne, works from the 1860s. But in the last decades of Cézanne's life, from the 1890s till his death in 1906, skulls become more prominent in his work, potentially as Cézanne himself, as he's aging, begins to contemplate his own mortality, and so very much taps into this tradition of memento mori, both for personal reasons, but also as a way of engaging, and this is oftentimes what artists are doing, and part of the argument I'm making here is that this is what Peter is doing in his work, engaging with this tradition, this long-standing tradition of memento mori, but sort of recasting it, reinventing it in their own way. So while we can come to this still life by Cézanne and recognize because of the subject its connection to memento mori, in many ways Cézanne is doing not something not quite as direct as we saw in the Dutch prototype, but using this skull and populating the skull in many ways as just one of many elements as part of this still life. That said, Cézanne is oftentimes creating images that have ambiguous aspects to them. And that's certainly the case in this picture. Oftentimes, when I talk about this picture with students or with visitors, standing at a bit of a distance, the piece of fruit on the plate just to the lower right of the skull, viewers oftentimes interpret the dark spot on it as a blemish or potentially even a rotten spot on the piece of fruit. And while that's a potential interpretation of it, on closer examination, both the shape of it, the color of it, and its placement can equally be read as a leaf of the piece of fruit, apple, peach, that has sort of fallen over and drapes over the piece of fruit. And this, as I said earlier, this is something we see Cézanne doing over and over again, creating elements in his still life that can be read, that are ambiguous and therefore can be read in multiple ways. But it continues to connect. And I think this is an important part of what Cézanne is doing. It continues to connect with that memento mori tradition. The other work that's likely more directly referencing the memento mori tradition is Young Man in Skull. And here, not only do we have the contemplative young man thinking about focusing, potentially drawing inspiration, or um, his thoughts being guided by both the books and manuscripts on the table, but also the skull, and then the skull and books themselves. As we saw earlier in the Dutch prototype by Van Dalen, that books are this vanitas element, right? So sort of calling into question the very pursuit of earthly knowledge, and by coupling it with the skull, again reminding us that those earthly pursuits ultimately are futile. Another thing that this picture, let me show you the full image here. Another thing that this picture resonates with are traditions like this. So oftentimes St. Jerome throughout uh, Christian iconography, St. Jerome is sort of shown in two different ways. One is this St. Jerome out in the desert, oftentimes shown with a lion. There's a whole story around that. St. Jerome was an ascetic, so he was one that was depriving himself of, or at least limiting himself to his, how much he ate and his clothing and so forth, intentionally living a kind of deprived life. But the other way that St. Jerome is often shown is as the scholar, as we see him here, um, deep in thought, likely contemplating religious ideas, theological ideas, but again, including the skull as that constant reminder of the purpose behind his intellectual pursuit, not for earthly reasons, but looking towards that ultimate reward of the afterlife. And indeed, skulls oftentimes populate Peter's work. But as I suggested or began to suggest with Cézanne's work, the skulls aren't as deliberate or as forthright as we see in the Dutch prototypes. Indeed, in images like this, the skull could just as easily be interpreted as a kind of votive candle. So again, it sort of taps into this idea of an ambiguous origins or ambiguous origins in general. Another example, and to give us sort of further elements within the Vanitas Memento Mori tradition, is this work, again by a Dutch artist, Jan van Kessel. Uh, Once again, we see the skull prominently displayed, but included with that are things such as wilting flowers, again showing the decay of the living towards leaning towards that ultimate inevitability of death. Also included, oftentimes in these still lifes, are delicate objects such as this glass vase. And the glass vase has sort of multiple readings. The delicacy of the vase itself, the materiality of it suggests the delicacy of life. And the transparency also has another kind of implication of the transparency of our earthly existence to God Himself, that God is aware of our dealings here on earth, and all along the way is not only aware but keeping watch on us. And this gives us an opportunity to come back to the Barnes collection. Two pictures that I think many viewers potentially overlook given their location in the sort of over in the corner in Gallery 15. But they're two French still lifes from the 17th and 18th century. And on encountering them, we could very easily just enjoy them as still lifes and enjoy the delicacy of how they'd been painted and the fine rendering of the elements of the subject. But if we view them through the lens of memento mori, we see sort of other ways or we potentially can think of these pictures in other ways. So, for instance, in the still life on the left, we see amongst the fruit, potentially apricots, we see that one of the piece of fruit, the piece at the extreme right, has been opened. And we see the stone revealed. And that, again, is a indication of the brevity of the ripeness, whether it's a piece of fruit or the ripeness of human existence. And in the still life on the right, we see reintroduced the idea of a fine glass vase, again, the delicacy and transparency. And in addition to this, something that one would have to know something about botany and flowers to be able to perceive, many of the elements in these still life, the flowers in particular, and the combination of the flowers with the fruit are objects or elements that would bloom and flourish at different times of the year. So, for instance, the flowers would have been a spring harvest of the spring, where the grapes and the peach or the apricots would have been harvested in the fall. So giving sort of the span of the seasons from early potentially to late. And bringing us back to Peter's work, we see these elements reoccurring in his work. So here, flowers placed in a fine, likely glass vase. And in addition, we'll come back to this work, other elements that extend the symbolic vocabulary of the memento mori vanitas tradition. Returning to the Van Kessel, the juxtaposition of a caterpillar with a butterfly or a moth. We saw earlier in the mosaic how the butterfly wings, one interpretation is potentially for representing the delicacy of the human soul. But juxtaposed this way, it also suggests the beginning, the end, the alpha, the omega, and how suggests to the viewer the transformation that the caterpillar undergoes to become the butterfly, again, resonating with the kind of transformation that the human soul might undertake through death and flourishing, blossoming into a spirit in the afterworld. And we see these similar kinds of symbols occurring in Peter's work. And interestingly, not conflating them together so that they're so obvious, but separating them across works. So in How Many Kings, if you can see, dangling from the still life are caterpillars. We see one suspended to the right, another one crawling at the upper center portion of the composition. And then on the right-hand side, infinite existence, we see the transformation of those into butterflies. Another element in the Kessel picture is the hourglass, a very sort of straightforward symbol that time is limited. And if we go back to Rage Against Time, we see how Peter, in many of the pictures, include timepieces. And it's interesting where uh, the in the Kessel piece, by the very nature of a painting, the sands of that hourglass are frozen in time, and the hands in the clocks in Peter's pictures themselves are frozen at a particular moment in time, but without removing the implication of the constant ticking of time forward. And then on top of the hourglass, we see this little dish and a straw and floating around soap bubbles. And this is one of the last sort of symbolic things we'll consider is the use of soap bubbles as an element, particularly again in the memento mori tradition. And we see in assembled magic, as we saw at the beginning, how soap bubbles float amongst this indecipherable mound, atop which we see this lit candle and reclining, potentially expired bird. But the inclusion of the soap bubbles, where I think oftentimes potentially viewers would connect it with the sort of childhood enjoyment of blowing bubbles. I know my children loved blowing bubbles. Um, but put in this context, and certainly drawing on the earlier tradition, the bubbles take on a bit more depth and meaning than that. And indeed, soap bubbles and the idea of blowing soap bubbles is one that resonates through the work of many artists working in this tradition, whether it's the German artist Sculptus, one of his potentially most famous engravings, uh, and including, this goes back, in many ways goes back uh, to the caterpillar butterfly combination, the child with the skull, the alpha and omega, the youth and the enjoyment of youth, the excitement and the carefreeness of youth and childhood. But in these combinations, connected with the skull, and again a reminder of the ultimate uh, end for all of us, and the soap bubbles being part of it. The very ephemeral nature of soap bubbles. They're enjoyable to look at, but none of them last very long. And we see that coupled with other works in the Saint Andre, Vanitas on our right. Here, the Vanitas images, and when we see them in combinations like this, we can really get a sense of the breadth of the kinds of objects that are often included in these still lifes. So here, including music, so the recorder, sheet music, the wine jug, uh, reminders of the limits of the ultimate earthly limits of these kinds of pursuits. An artist who was particularly fascinated with this subject was Jean-Simeon Chardin. This image of a young boy leaning over a sill, blowing a bubble, observed by a younger child behind, is one that Chardin actually made two copies of. It seemed to so resonate with him. And what's fascinating, this sort of fits into what I said both about Peter's work, but also about Cezanne, is that Chardin sort of secularizes this subject, where in the previous one, the symbolism of it is very forthright, right, with the combination of the bubbles with the skulls and the other objects. With the Chardin, we can easily enjoy it simply as a young boy enjoying the pleasure of blowing soap bubbles. But if we bring to it this understanding of memento mori, then it enriches and deepens the potential interpretation of the subject. And this gives us an opportunity to return. So we could actually come back to Gallery 13. We had looked at the crucifixion that's on the opposite wall. Now we look at the east wall to one of two little genre scenes by Chardin, again, French 18th century painter. We're going to look at the one on the on the left-hand side, rather. And this, again, could easily be looked at simply as a working genre scene, right? Of a housemaid in the midst of doing her her job, doing laundry. We see another woman through the door in the connecting room, hanging that laundry up. But it's the child that might now draw our attention. The inclusion of the child blowing a soap bubble in the context of the larger scene is highly appropriate. Now, however, with the idea of memento mori sort of lodged in our minds, or as a lens through which we might consider this picture, it takes on potentially deeper and alternative implications. So each of these, my hope is that as we look at Peter's work, we might consider not only what is obvious to us, take enjoyment in recognizing the unusual arrangement and juxtaposition of objects, but now potentially bring to it a richer understanding of this other layer of potential meaning that many of the elements in Peter's pictures hint at. So before I conclude, I want to call our attention to one final thing, and that's with regards to both Peter's paintings, but paintings in general. I'm not an artist myself, but I spend a lot of time looking at paintings and thinking about paintings. And one of the many things that brings me back to paintings is the permanence of their image. And this is, I think, another sort of inflection of many of the pictures in this exhibition, that Peter is choosing things that themselves have an impermanence to them. right? So that they're things, whether they're cakes or sweets, whether they're animals, whether they're slugs or cats or insects, whether they're flowers, all of them, if they were real in our real world, would eventually expire. They would decay, they would die, they would fade away. Paintings, and this is one of the magics of painting, paintings hold them there for us to continue and potentially endlessly contemplate. Unlike the cakes themselves, that in a week or a month would have been would deteriorate, we can come back to Peter's paintings and we can experience these things over and over and over again. It gives us the opportunity to contemplate these things that, again, oftentimes in the real world are transitory. They're here, they're gone. Paintings lock them for potentially for eternity. So we, as interested viewers, can return to them, experience them, and each time, and this was certainly my experience with Peter's work, each time I experience them, I'm seeing something different, something I hadn't noticed before. I'm seeing relationships that didn't present themselves initially. So, in many ways, paintings like this are a never-ending gift to us. And as I said at the beginning, I want to encourage you, if you haven't seen the exhibition, to go and see it. And if you have seen it, go back to see it. And I'll leave you with one parting thought. And this is something that I likely couldn't have shown you here uh, over an online presentation, and that is the care with which Peter paints his settings. Um, Even in a picture like this, a still life set against what seems like a fairly simple blank wall. If you look closely at it, there's a richness to color and texture and depth. It really creates a magical surface that is as captivating as the objects themselves. Um, so focus not only on the subject, but also the rest of the picture. And I suspect that that's something that Peter has continued from his time at the Barnes Foundation. One of the points that we in teaching from the collection or constantly trying to instill in our picture, in our students rather, is to look at the entire picture. Look not just at the center, but through the entire surface. Because the best paintings have something to reveal to you no matter where you look. And on that note, I'd like to thank you for joining me this evening. And I think we have some time for questions, if there are any.
Thank you so much, Bill, for that really wonderful history and analysis and close looking with Peter's work. I love how you emphasize the richness and detail of the paintings. And I hope, Jen, people should enter questions in the Q&A. Is that right? And we'll be happy to Bill, I'm sure will be happy to answer them. What
Absolutely.
you said kind of at the end too, Bill, about the this idea of the permanence of the paintings versus the impermanence of their subjects makes me think of frequently in the exhibition, people ask me, or if Peter's there, they ask Peter if he has any pets, because he, paints cats and other animals pretty frequently. And Peter always answers that he has wonderful pets. They're all painted. They're easy to care for. You don't have to find somebody to take care of them when you go away. So it made me think of that specifically. Um,
Again, that's the wonder of paintings, right? It can give us things that we might not actually want in our everyday lives,
mhm.
but we can have in pictures permanently.
Mhm. Um, We have a question in the Q&A from Alyssa, but wondering if there is significance in the colors used in the paintings. And I suppose that question can both be applied to the Vanitas paintings you showed and then also Peter's work.
I think in particularly focusing on Peter's work, another thing that struck me was the combinations of colors. Oftentimes, and it wasn't something that I focused on here, but that specific colors play really important roles in his pictures. I'm thinking of several where there are sort of pictorial elements, maybe what looks like beads or little balls that are red, for instance, that are scattered throughout a composition. And then there'll be a kind of decorative linear element, a kind of swirling line that runs through it. Uh, and sometimes there's a little shadow behind it that suggests some depth. And then in many of those, he'll sign his name in the same color. And what's fascinating about that is that it's both giving the illusion of depth of space. This is for me, another fascinating aspect of paintings, the sense of looking into a picture and having a sense of depth or volume. Um, but then using that same color as a signature that's so clearly on the surface of the picture sort of belies that illusion of depth of space.
Hmm.
And there's several instances through his works where it seems very deliberately using colors to both create and then deny either qualities of space or effects of decorativeness, for instance.
Hmm. Your mention of this of the red dot, which visitors to the show have also seen in many of his works, and I know it was discussed with Peter at one point when he was in the show as well. And I think of those like kind of bright spots of red to me is somehow also kind of related to those fans of the Michener will know, for example, Edward Redfield, the way he would paint, you'd have a snow scene and a figure with a cart kind of on a snowy road, but the figure might have a red hat, right? And it's like this kind of draws your eye into the painting too. And I know Peter is very much attuned to there's just the formal qualities of his work, right? And how colors relate to one another, how shapes relate to one another. And I assume he's thinking about that as well. What's drawing the eye into the work? How is the painting well balanced?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and along with that is also, and we see that in this image here, is his balance of elements that are highly decorative,
Hmm.
like the tapestry that the cake stand sits on, or the cake itself, or the rim of it, where other areas are much plainer, much simpler. And so there's this nice balance that allows the decorative areas to stand out. But again, as I said at the end, looking closely at what seems like a kind of blank background is actually really quite varied, both in color and texture and depth.
Hmm. Some other questions from the chat. Is Peter unique among modern and or contemporary artists exploring memento mori or vanitas in their work?
I think unique certainly in the way that he's doing it. But as we've seen, now for thousands of years, memento mori is something that sort of humankind constantly returns to. And there are similar models in other art forms, right? One can think of literature, obviously, but also theater and music. And um, we, as human beings, for all of our arrogance, we can't help but be aware of the inevitability that faces all of us. And wherever that sort of fits within our personal timeline, at some point, I think most all of us are going to contemplate it in some way. And here again is one of the gifts that the arts and paintings give to us is that it's an opportunity to confront that, right? At a time when we don't have to, right? Because most of us, there's a point where we have to confront it, but it gives us a moment to sort of exercise that experience in the setting of an art gallery. Um, but just yeah, just as a human reminder.
Mhm. One artist that that question kind of reminded me of. So it was after Peter's show closes in March. In April, we'll have another exhibition opening at the Michener in that same gallery of photographs by Bruce Katzeff, who well-known photographer, also former director of the Michener Art Museum. But he has a body of work that also I would say is tied to these themes of Vanitas, where he artfully arranged and photographed animal remains and bones, and is very much thinking about I think more like a kind of a Dutch style cabinet of curiosity. So he's also thinking about that tradition and bringing that into his photography. So a
That's
different medium, but still kind of an interest in that theme. Apparently, that's going to be the theme of that gallery for the next couple shows or so. Um, I know we're running a little low on short on time, but it will take maybe another question or two. We have a question. If do you see any relationship to the precarious nature of the objects in these paintings and the notion of impermanence? So this idea that things look like they might fall off of a tabletop or, yeah, might not be completely stable in their setting.
Absolutely. And I considered including that in this talk. In fact, it could have been a talk in and of itself. Oftentimes, Peter in his compositions is doing another thing that's wonderful and almost exclusively possible in paintings, creating compositional balance. So things that couldn't physically happen in the real world have a sense of at least visual stability. In the method, we call it a balance of equivalence. Things that have a kind of equivalent visual weight to them create a sense of equilibrium that in the real world couldn't happen. So, yes, the answer is absolutely.
And then a question I think I probably prompted by looking at this painting, especially Birthday, although there's other works in the show that have snails, but a question about the snails and the significance of them. Um, I'm curious too if there's a tradition of snails in any, like, does that relate to Vanitas at all? I mean, snails is very slow moving. I'm trying to think of other touch paintings I've seen. Just have they,
They
if they
do,
have
they do show up,
okay.
and I think one of the reasons I uh, close with this is another aspect of paintings like this is that we can actually find enjoyment in things that in real life would be repulsive, actually, right? I mean, if this was in our home, this is not something we would sit around contemplating, but in the guise of a painting it transforms into something else. And snails, there are couple things that seem to recur over and over again. Serpents and snakes seem to surface now and then. Insects, as we see both in Peter's work as well as in others. Flies, for instance, seem to be embedded in many, particularly Dutch Vanitas still lifes.
Mhm. Pamela, who asked the question, has this great observation about the fact that snails, their skeletons are external. So like something about like, I don't know, there's um like that if that you think of the shell as the more permanent part of the snail's body as something that's outside rather than inside. I think that's kind of interesting. I'm
Uh,
also
there,
thinking too about snails being like associated with like decaying things and that could be a possibility too.
Agreed.
But in terms of like Peter, and I know he's also in the audience, I think too. So it's funny talking about what Peter thinks when Peter might also be listening. But I think a lot of the objects and animals and creatures that occur throughout his paintings are things or objects or items that like kind of he's almost like visually gathered across his life and likes to use. And so you'll see that frequently throughout like not just this body of work, but other bodies of work that he's made these recurring subjects. So that's and he latches on to some like asparagus appears a lot in a lot of his paintings too. cats, cakes, and snails are another example of that.
Agreed.
Yeah, well, I think that's all of our questions, and we are at time. But I want to thank you again, Bill. This was really wonderful. Thanks so much for your time today and for taking us on this great art historical journey.
My pleasure.
All right, take care, everybody, and I hope you will come and see the exhibition.
Please do.